Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today I'm just going to be talking a little bit about the books that I've been reading over the last week. Also, just a heads up, I'm going to be away on holiday next week, so we'll probably not be able to record a weekly read then. There'll be something else in its place. But just as a heads up that, that'll be the case. But let's talk a little bit about some of these books that I've been reading recently. First up, I read Revolutionary Acts by Jason Okundaye, and this is a really fascinating non-fiction book that looks at particularly Black gay British history, particularly, I suppose, in the last sort of 50 or so years, really, is sort of where most of this sort of happened. And it's really fascinating because these are voices and sort of perspectives and histories that we don't often hear quite as much of. And I think Jason Okundaye does a really fantastic job of really allowing people's voices to shine through. A lot of this book is told through sort of stories gathered from interviews. And so the book kind of has this narrative-like feel to it, but really is sort of people telling their stories. And you get this really fascinating thing throughout a lot of this book where, you know, you've got the stories of two people who say like, oh, well, absolutely, you need to talk to Simon, for example. Simon will tell you all about this thing. And then there's a moment talking to Simon. These are just names I'm adding in. And then it's Simon's turn to talk, and you just hear Simon go like, ugh, why did those two ask me? And just this great moment of sort of remembering that in every one of these moments of history, in all of these sort of moments of kind of activism or campaigning, we're dealing with people, and people will have, dated each other or slept with each other or had fallings out or whatever. And so what comes up so often in this book is just these little moments of people having had their own sort of personal relationships with each other that were or were not great. And I think, but I mean, all of that sort of isn't to dampen what I think is a real triumph of this book, which is to really delve into some really fascinating stories of these, particularly men, over sort of history, and particularly, you know, looking at areas, particularly of London, so areas like Brixton, where there were these sort of underground scenes for Black gay men that kind of have sort of disappeared in some ways now, or have kind of moved and morphed into other things. And it's so interesting to read a history of the UK, and particularly of sort of UK kind of gay culture through this lens, in a way where, you know, actually so many of these men's stories just were not told, and actually they're sort of being excavated in this really brilliant way here in this book. Next up, a different prize, but one that I'm reading at the moment, and that is How to Say Babylon by Safiya Sinclair. And this is just a real triumph of a book, I think. So it was shortlisted now for the Women's Non-Fiction Prize, the first one, and it's a really incredible book, I think, in many ways. So Safiya is a poet, and actually there's a part where she talks about being a poet, and I was like, aha, this makes sense, because this book is told in this really rich, lyrical, thoughtful way all the way throughout, where sort of, particularly listening to the audiobook, which she reads herself, there's a real rhythm and a pace to it, where sometimes, you know, it's almost not choosing the word that would typically be in a sentence, but a different word because it kind of sounds better and it keeps the rhythm of what she's trying to say. So I found this book really engaging in so many ways. I think it's deeply, deeply clever. But it's also, the story that it's telling is a really heartbreaking one. And I had to almost keep reminding myself that this was a real person's life as opposed to a fictional story. So Safiya grows up in Jamaica, and she is sort of born into a family where they are sort of part of Rastafari as kind of culture and sort of beliefs. And a large part of what that means for her, particularly as a young child, is that she's very much in sort of, very much does what her father says, and what he says goes. That's kind of the rule of the house. And slowly but surely we see over this book how there are moments of their relationship that's particularly complicated because of this, where he has some quite strict rules of particularly how she and her sisters and her mother should be behaving, and, you know, in terms of what they wear, in terms of who they talk to, in terms of their behavior, in a way that often isn't applied equally to some of the boys in the family. And she really struggles with this, kind of having an almost sort of identity crisis of, well, if I'm not Rastafari, or if I go against Rastafari rules or whatever in this way, who does that make me? Who am I still, sort of regardless of that? And it just turns into this really glorious book where she talks about sort of being a burgeoning writer and trying to kind of express herself through that, trying to deal with some sort of real moments of violence in the house and in the family, and what to do with all of that, and just all of this other stuff within the family. And without spoiling how this book ends, I think there's something really powerful about the way that she tries to reconcile some of the very complicated feelings she's having throughout this book, of being horrified at some of the violence that's going on around her, but being kind of told that she needs to keep quiet or needs to just let things happen because she's in a precarious situation. And the ways that she's able to advocate for herself and strike out and become her own person, but then also understanding that she has this sort of duty or this kind of relation back to her family. It's so complicated and so thorny, but I think that's her real gift as a writer, is to be able to put all of those things out there and to let you kind of sit in the weeds, sort of trying to work out what is going on. It's really beautifully told. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure the physical book is great too. If you get a chance to listen to her read it as part of the audiobook, do. She is remarkable at sort of reading this. It felt almost like, 14, 15, however long the book is, hours of almost like performance poetry. It has that real rhythm and that real bounce to it. There's something about the playfulness of some of the phrases, or the kind of wordplay going on sometimes, that's so brilliant. I think this is exquisite. Keeping with non-fiction, I then read Tangled in Terror by Suhaiymah Manzoor-Khan. And this is sort of, the Pluto Press did this sort of set of, I still are doing, this set of books all about sort of specific topics, sort of political topics, or kind of having people pull apart something kind of complicated. And then here, this is a book really often looking at Islamophobia. And it does it in this really interesting way, because, you see so many books that talk about Islamophobia in a really cogent, really interesting way. But I think this book really nails the kind of geopolitical nature of some of this, and some of the really thorny things that I had not really considered or hadn't really sat and broken down in some ways. So for example, she at one point does this really interesting thing where she talks about how the ways that politicians often talk about Islam, or talk about kind of people from other countries, often positions things in this really odd way. And she focuses in at one point on a political situation that I remember quite clearly, which was David Cameron at the time talking about kind of the need for migrants to integrate, and particularly to have English lessons, whilst at the same time cutting funding to those same English lessons. And she really sort of turns a sort of laser focus on that, about the various implications that came from that, not only in terms of that feeling like a slightly dud policy or thing to say, but also the ways that it positions only is sort of Muslim migrants as coming under that umbrella, and the way that it particularly positions Muslim women as sort of helpless people who need to be saved, very strong air quotes here, by sort of white British folk. And the sort of insidious ways that actually sort of impacts then how we talk about various policies or various people. And so it's a really clever and thought through book that really challenged a lot of things, or at least sort of, I suppose, pushed my thinking a little bit further on a few things, which was really great. A difficult, uncompromising read, but a book nonetheless that I think is really vital and really important. On a lighter note, I read Local Fires by Joshua Jones, and this is a set of short stories, and was sort of shortlisted for the Dylan Thomas Prize, and really interesting in many, many ways. So he writes particularly about place, so they're all set in Wales, particularly around Llanelli, and he talks really... these stories are sort of interconnected, with him talking about the people and places around there, particularly queer characters, particularly with some kind of overarching thing often around neurodiversity, and Joshua Jones himself being autistic and sort of neurodivergent in other ways, kind of bringing that into part of the storytelling. And so what we kind of get is this really sort of set of absurd stories, almost telling this set of characters who are often bored with where they are or kind of frustrated with things around them, and they all know each other from school, or they all know each other from various places, and there's this kind of malaise that's sort of within it, but also this real fun of the kind of knowing what they can get up to and what they can do and where they can go. And so as a result, you've kind of got these odd stories that focus in on, you know, various queer characters sort of trying to strike out in the world, but not in a really big kind of... A lot of short stories, I guess, would typically focus around the identity part sort of first and foremost, whereas often in these short stories, there's something absurd going on. You know, the titles alone, for example, reference The Simpsons or Clive Jones or like various other people. And so there's this kind of oddness, and kind of, it feels quite often like the short stories themselves are not necessarily mocking you, but they're kind of playing with you and kind of inviting you to come in and sort of mosey about and sort of understand the world around them. Before I go on to the International Booker Prize books I've been reading this week, I've also been reading some of the Armistead Maupin books from the Tales of the City series, kind of in anticipation of his new one. So I'm sort of slowly ticking away with those in the background, but they are really fun. I'd previously read, I think, the first 4 or 5, and I've been listening to the audiobooks of a few of the other ones kind of in the lead up, which have been great fun. I forget just how much joy there is in some of these stories. The most recent one I've just finished reading is Michael Tolliver Lives, which I really loved. I think in some ways it has a little bit more of a kind of raunch and sexiness and silliness, particularly because it's focused on Michael Tolliver, and we get to basically see a gay man in his 50s, who's HIV positive, but living in a way that means he gets to be this messy, sexual, interesting character, and there's something so great about that that is often missing, I think, in so many other books. So yeah, I've been really, really enjoying them, and I'm very, very excited for, I think, is it Mona of the Manor coming out? I think it's just come out. So I'm going to catch up with the last few books of that first and then go on to that as well. And sort of finally, we come to the International Booker Prize books that I've read this week. Again, I've done solo reviews of these that are either already out or that will be coming soon. So I'll do a bit of a quick glide through them here. Domenico Starnone's The House on Via Gemito, translated by Oonagh Stransky, a really interesting family epic that took a little bit to get going for me, but deals a lot with this idea of living in sort of your father's shadow and trying to understand who you are when your father is this well-known person locally, and there's this kind of baggage that's caught up with it. And it examines quite a lot, I think, that's quite interesting about being a family member of somebody and trying to reconcile the good and bad parts of them, and kind of how complicated that can feel to sort of understand that your father, who you look up to and revere, is also a flawed person, but also that there are these redeeming qualities that also work alongside some of those horrible ones. So yeah, I thought that was really, really interesting in that sense. On a very similar theme, Gabriela Wiener's Undiscovered, translated by Julia Sanches, I thought was really interesting for how it examined a similar thing of the main character who, like with Domenico Starnone's book, both of these characters are sort of self-inserts. These are kind of almost auto-fiction, this book especially so. And I think Undiscovered does a lot of looking at her life, and particularly knowing that her surname, a sort of slightly unusual surname for Peru, where she is, marks her out as being related to somebody who has been involved in colonial acts of sort of taking artifacts from countries. And so she has to reconcile that with not only being Peruvian, but also her identity and who she is, and everybody seeing her name and automatically associating her with that guy. And so it plays a lot with this kind of idea of being in family shadow as well. I didn't always get on with it, but I think overall it has a lot to say that I think was very interesting. And last but not least of all of these, Simpatía by Rodrigo Blanco Calderón, translated by Noel Hernández González and Daniel Hahn. And this is a book that deals also with sort of some of these ideas, particularly around this sort of slightly absurd nature. So a long story short is that there is a man who basically inherits a sort of home and a job, which is to turn over this old building into being a dog shelter. And this is a dog shelter in and amongst a place that is Caracas in Venezuela, that is seen as being corrupt, or at least the main character kind of is looking at the kind of corruption and the danger around him. And he's got this almost absurd task of looking after dogs in the middle of all of it. And there's something in there about his sort of absurdity and purity almost in a world that is otherwise quite cruel. But we also see that he is not perfect in all of that as well. So yeah, really interesting 3 books. That was a very quick whistle-stop tour, but otherwise this video would be about 4 hours long. But yes, really interesting to read some more of these International Booker books, and more broadly to have some other books in the mix as well. It's been a fun reading week. As I mentioned, I'm going to be away for a week, or just about, in Iceland. So I will disappear for a little bit, and there may not be a weekly reads video, because I basically get back and that's when I'd normally be recording the video. So we shall see how that happens. I may be back in time and manage to get it done, but I doubt it. Either way, have a great reading week. There'll be some kind of video coming up. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.